Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. Hello, and welcome to WITA's Exchange podcast. We're recording this week's episode on Friday, October 24th at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we're discussing today may have changed. In fact, if we had recorded this yesterday or even last night, the news about U.S.-Canada trade negotiations would have changed. Coincidentally, a senior U.S. business leader I know was talking to a Canadian government official this week who commented, "We've only got one trade agreement to worry about. You guys have the whole world. I don't know how you do it." That's a question I know a lot of folks in D.C. and around the world are wondering as the trade news keeps coming. And this week's podcast, we've got a lot of ground to cover. And we have just the team to do it. Welcome back to the Exchange podcast to Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC Affairs. Dan Mullaney, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East. Dawn Shackleford, President at Looking Glass Trade LLC. Dawn is the former Executive Director for Trade Agreements and Negotiations at the Department of Commerce and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for WTO and Multilateral Affairs. And our discussion leader again today, Joe DeMond, Chair of International Trade Policy and Global Life Sciences at Crow Global Advisors, and the former Acting Assistant USTR for Asia and the Pacific, among other roles. Joe?
You can. Good morning, everybody. A lot to talk about as usual this week. And as Ken noted, there's something, a headline that just emerged in the last half day or so that we were not expecting to discuss, which is that President Trump said that he would be terminating or halting trade negotiations with our closest neighbor and one of our largest trading partners, Canada, in reaction to a TV commercial that highlighted remarks made in 1987 by President Reagan, where he was talking about the dangers of tariffs. So I don't know what to say about this. Let me just say two things. Maybe there's not much to say about it. First of all, I think if anything demonstrates that there's a lot of whim behind our trade policy, this does, because it just came out of nowhere. And secondly, from our perspective, I would assume this isn't really about trade. This is about a commercial about trade. So he's sort of retaliating against a TV commercial. And what do you say? We're trade experts. You don't need to be a trade expert to know that. And then what happens next? So reactions, comments.
So my initial reaction is that the good news is that Trump didn't respond by slapping another 25% tariff on Canada, right? He dialed it back a bit, cutting off negotiations. And frankly, there have been a lot of quiet negotiations going on between the US and Canada. My understanding is focusing mainly on trying to see if there's any room to relax the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are really hurting Canada. But let's just be honest, this is not a positive development. And particularly as folks start preparing for the USMCA review, I think this development overnight kind of sends a chill as we prepare for that review, because it's not going to be business as normal.
I mean, my first reaction was, well, what did the Canadians think was going to happen? It was pretty predictable that there was going to be some kind of reaction, and you can think it's you can agree or disagree with the reaction, but it seems I don't know, a little bit foolhardy and pretty predictable what that commercial like that would have triggered.
Don, any dad?
Just Wow. I just,
Well,
yep.
I mean, just another footnote, by the way, I don't know if this makes any difference. It was the province of Ontario that sponsored ostensibly, the commercial, and not the government of Canada. I don't know if that's, obviously the president couldn't care less. Ontario's biggest province. So, but, politicians are going to be politicians. This is very popular in Canada. And clearly they wanted to get that to Canadian audiences, taking a tough stand against Trump. But I guess we'll see what happens. If there's, it's hard to believe that a TV commercial is going to, for a very long period, stop the somewhat productive discussions that were going on, the workmanlike discussions that were going on between the two countries. And we are very large trading partners of each other. There's a lot at stake. So I don't think any of us are in a position to predict how it will happen, but probably will. Maybe at one of these Asian summits or something like that.
I think it'll ultimately probably be a blip on the screen. Yeah. And you're right. I'm sure the target was the his Canadian audience, but I think the commercial was scheduled for broadcast in the United States shortly, so that might also be a bit behind the president.
Yeah, I saw it. I mean, I was saying I saw it it was playing during one of the baseball games last week, which I think was the Toronto Blue Jays playing the Seattle Mariners, and so people on both sides of the border saw that one. If it was broadcast, I assume it was also broadcast in Canada. So, yeah, I mean,
so one thought here, given that I believe the Toronto Blue Jays are going now into the World Series with LA Dodgers, there are going to be lots of ads going on. Maybe yeah. Ottawa should think about one just underscoring the close economic relationship and interdependence and integrated markets between the U.S. and Canada.
See.
Maybe
Wendy,
focusing on
you're also a talented media advisor, Wendy. That's good advice. I'm sorry, Dawn, I cut you off.
No, I just said maybe they could highlight the close dependence on steel and aluminum between our two countries as well, since we've kind of been
like that.
Possibly shooting ourselves in the foot on some of the steel and aluminum imports, particularly aluminum, given how much was coming from Canada.
Yeah, and there's pain being felt, clearly.
I don't know. Do they use aluminum bats in the World Series?
They don't use aluminum bats in Wendy. In the Major League Baseball, they still use wooden bats. So but now they wouldn't be. But wait a minute, there's tariffs on lumber as well. So could be impacted. Let's move on to what would have been, I think, and what we talked about last week as well, which is that this is a big week in Asia. There's going to be the ASEAN leaders meeting earlier in the week. President Trump goes to Japan for a day or two after that to meet the new Japanese prime minister. And then there are the APEC summit, APEC leaders meeting at the end of the week in Korea. And there's a lot going on, but let's just unpack it a little bit. Let's start with sort of the main event itself, that Trump is going to see Xi Jinping, supposedly. I think it's seems like, for next Thursday. The first meeting of the two of this administration, there's obviously a huge agenda. And Trump has said, in the last day or so, that they're going to discuss a whole lot of things, and he expects to reach settlement, agreement on many of these issues. It's very, but what can we really expect, to happen? What's changed? And there's been developments in the past week. So who wants to start with that? I have some thoughts, but
So from my perspective, I think it's going to be very important to watch the outcomes of the Besant, Greer, Hulifeng meetings that are, I think, starting today, but taking place over the next couple of days. This is going to be a key meeting to see if they can de-escalate, and that means de-escalating not only the export controls that have been threatened and put in place, but also the tariffs and other measures that have been announced. And then whether they can even agree to some immediate pressing issues that the president has put on the agenda, like soybeans and fentanyl. But again, I think this meeting at the Treasury Secretary level is going to be very telling in terms of what we can expect from the Xi-Trump meeting. I mean, I continue to believe that there will be there'll be a de-escalation. Either both sides will announce just a delay in all these measures while they keep talking, or maybe they actually agree to unwind and then put out new deadlines 3, 6 months out there. One key announcement I think that will be worth watching coming out of the Xi-Trump meeting is, do they announce a visit by Trump to China early next year? Remember, Trump very much wants to go to China. He did tweet that out a few weeks ago after his call with Xi Jinping. And if there is a meeting, and if he is going to China, that would suggest there's another action forcing event to help keep de-escalation and stabilization in place, but also maybe to make some inroads on some immediate issues. And I use the word immediate because, Trump keeps talking about a big deal, a grand bargain. From my point of view, both sides are just working hard to keep all the pieces together and just, and not fall apart at this juncture.
I think it was helpful to see the recent agreement between the United States and Australia on the critical minerals, just given all the focus between China and the United States on the critical minerals issue, and for the United States to be able to go into these conversations, having that agreement in their pocket as something that it doesn't level the playing field, but it at least helps, I think, put a little bit of a finger on the scale for the United States that, we are really investing, as is Australia, in these other options. In China, we're not going to necessarily going to be reliant on you in the long term. So I think that was a helpful development in advance of these discussions.
It sends a clear signal. It is, as you say, Dawn, a longer run play, right? In the short run, for the foreseeable year or whatever, however long, it takes a long time to get these minerals out of the ground and to refine them and to set up refineries, which are quite dirty. So in the shorter run, China has the leverage. In the longer run, I think actually, I'm not sure this is all that divisive, right? That it makes sense for the U.S. and probably other countries to lessen their dependence on Chinese critical minerals, and that's what's happening. And so this issue over time will, dissipate, I would think. But it does. I think the timing was good. It was smart diplomacy, I think, for the Australians and lead up to the meeting.
I think Europe is going to be watching closely the talks with China too, because at the same time as the United States is encouraging Europe to work with the United States to push back on non-market economy policies and practices, and they're weighing the wisdom of doing that given their investments in China. They then see the president maybe cutting some grand deal with China that leaves EU out in the cold. So I think both the EU and the UK are watching that. And of course, when China reacts to U.S. actions, it tends to hit Europe as well, as we saw with the critical minerals issue. So I think the EU and UK and others are going to be watching that meeting very carefully.
Absolutely.
And an interesting development here is that Besant, came out and, was advocating working with our G7 partners and other countries to collectively respond to this new sweeping export control critical minerals regulation by China. And again, like pivoting from just unilaterally acting towards more of a collective approach. I don't know if this is a sign that the administration is beginning to realize, particularly when it comes to China, but other issues as well, is that there is a strong argument to be made for actually working with our allies and partners and not trying to, pressure them to provide more market access as the defining point of our relationship with them.
It's green shoots, right?
And I think,
sorry.
The administration, I think, has generally taken the tack that they're acting unilaterally, obviously, but I think they generally recognize that working with allies is better than not working with allies. And you had, Jameson Greer talking about the steel forum, and then a little bit more, the U.S. stepping up with respect to Russia sanctions, where yesterday the EU passed a huge sanctions package, and yesterday Trump put on his own sanctions on Russia, and I think Europe was worried about that. So I think there is a sense, I think, that the administration is looking towards working with allies when they can. But of course, if allies are not going to, work in lockstep, I think the United States is not going to slow down because the allies aren't with them.
Yeah, I agree with Dan, that I'm seeing Ambassador Greer's speech, which for the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, kind of having some overtures toward multilateralism. And the timing is good with the U.S. host year of the G20 next year, presents some opportunity, if not for necessarily concrete outcomes. G20 is a little challenging given its membership, but it does present the opportunity for, you're going to have some key players here in the United States who are also G7 members. And a lot of the planning for the G7, with the G7 host year being in 2027 for the United States, will be done next year. So being able to take advantage of G20 key players being here for certain opportunities to meet with, to lay the groundwork for G7 to potentially do more in this space of addressing overcapacity related issues is something that I hope they will take advantage of. And just one more note on multilateralism. I was happy to see Ambassador Barloon get sworn in for the WTO, and we now have DDG Nordquist out in Geneva as well. So maybe some good news for multilateralism in Geneva too. I can dare to hope.
We need to come up with a different word.
The U.S.
I was going to say, at least they're at the table. At least we're there at the table. People are representing the administration, which is better than having an empty chair there. Sorry, Dan.
I was going to say that the US-EU deal, when it comes to steel and aluminum, talks about tariff-free quota, but also talks about considering a ring fence around our economies, which I think is something that becomes maybe more obviously effective when you're talking about more partners like the G7. So that's easily a concept that is that it seems like it's something that would be ready to be multilateralized to some effect.
To do that, I think, wouldn't the U.S. need to then loosen up its tariffs on our trading partners? That there still is a zero. I think the administration still has sort of and I didn't see the details of Greer's speech. Don, maybe you can talk about that. But the general perspective of the U.S. has been zero-sum game, where it's U.S. against the rest of the world. And so we have tariffs on our allies as well as on countries like China, which is, the source of a lot of this overcapacity, maybe all of it. But if you're going to do a deal with your allies, there's got to be something in it for them too, I would think.
Yeah. Well, the US-EU deal has,
Right.
tariff rate quota,
Yeah.
probably based on historical trade plus the ring fence. So those two aspects, you're absolutely right, Joe. Those two aspects would be covered. And it does seem like something that we were looking at several years ago, expanding beyond US and the EU to include other partners.
I think there has always been this recognition, and you guys will remember from the early days of the first Trump administration before the 232s actually went into effect. And Dan, I think you were personally involved in a number of the discussions that were going on acknowledging that the U.S. market alone can't necessarily get China to do what we need it to do in terms of the overcapacity. But this is why we need the Europeans, we need Japan. We had this whole trilateral effort to try and work towards a cohesive solution across these economies, because we really need everybody rowing in the same direction, including Canada, including Australia. Unfortunately, a different policy direction was taken with the 232s, but if they could get back to, they can continue to use the 232s, but complement that with this going back to some of these relationships. And Joe, I'm not sure if they do think they need to pay our allies. And I say that just in that, there has been such a focus on this reciprocity issue, from the Trade Liberation Day. But even before that, having worked with Ambassador Lighthizer, this is something that he was very focused on. And if you haven't seen it yet, there's an article in the Foreign Affairs that just came out this week by Oren Cass specifically focused on this idea of reciprocity in both trade and security. And, really that this administration feels very strongly that they've been kind of carrying the weight economically and security wise for all of these other countries for decades now. And it's time for these other countries to step up. So I'm not sure that there is a payment that they think they need to make to these other countries right now. They kind of just consider it their due.
And I guess my question is a very good point, Don. It makes total sense. And I guess what I'd like to ask you both, or all of you, is do our allies, the likes of Canada, Europe, other countries, Japan, feel the same way, or do they feel, are they going to sign on to something? I could see totally the U.S. perspective on this. Do they feel like it's fair and the right, and can they do that politically?
I mean, on the EU side, if you ask anybody in the EU, they would say no. There's no imbalance here. At the same time, I think there's a speak of pragmatism that suggests that maybe you may need to, do something a little, do something to give Trump a win on some of those issues. But in their heart of hearts, I don't think they feel that the relationship's been non-reciprocal, but they're willing to come to the table and negotiate as if there were something to be rebalanced.
It's interesting to see the increase in defense spending, though, that there is a bit of an acknowledgement. I mean, you're seeing from the Europeans, from the Australians, they have to start doing more, and they're doing it.
Right. And that, what concerns me about that is, and something similar is happening on the trade side too. You could argue that we've all negotiated with many of these countries. There are many things in a lot of these negotiations. I'm thinking particularly in Asia, I never would have expected to have been on the table. And in multilateral negotiations, they were never put on the table. They couldn't do this. And then a gun is put to their head, so to speak, and they're doing it. The agreements that are being negotiated with Southeast Asia, the U.S. is insisting that these countries eliminate their tariffs on 99% of U.S. exports. That would have been unthinkable, I think, in a multilateral or even anything other than a free trade agreement, which is, of course, not a tool that we're using these days. And it sends us. I mean, I'm just concerned. It sends this signal about that kind of reinforces, what the Trump administration believes about the need to take a hard line. And maybe I think what Ambassador Lighthizer believed too. They're not going to do this unless you really force the game. And that's the argument. And is there a way, and maybe I'll ask you this, Wendy, because I know there's a lot of talk, about in Asia and other places about trying to reinvigorate plurilateral, bilateral, multilateral negotiations. Is there a way to show that style of doing things, the style that we all came up in, is a viable way to go forward? Or is it going to be law of the jungle where the big countries, the big trading countries like the US and China call the shots?
Look,
Good question.
There's clearly a move in Asia, but really around the world among medium and smaller countries to lessen their dependence on the US market and on the US as a source of imports and work more with other countries, right, to help them lessen their dependence. And I think one of the stories that folks here in the US are not focusing on in terms of this big week in Asia is not just which deals the US may announce or the US or Trump may sign with another leader, but I think we're going to see a lot of announcements of progress or even finalization of agreements or new countries joining existing agreements throughout this week in Asia. In other words, there's a lot of not just FTA activity, but a lot of work on, sectoral issues like digital or climate-related trade issues, AI, and just kind of commercial agreements that are going to be announced. So again, it's going to be hard overnight to substitute the US market with these other markets, but clearly there's a drive to do so. And I think we're going to see more and more activity among our trading partners reaching agreements. And, again, we won't get the benefits from those agreements. They will be reserved for the other signatories to any of these deals.
Yeah, and to your point, at the EU Leaders Summit yesterday, there was a big shot in the arm given to the EU-Mercosur agreement, which has been on the rocks for a really long time. So in some ways, Europe owes us a debt of gratitude in encouraging to get some of the other third country deals that they've been working on over the line.
Including India. I think we're helping them, right? We're helping give some momentum to those talks. Right?
Yeah, see, they do owe us big.
Yeah. So I guess that we'll see how that turns out. But there's clearly a lot of activity going on. Don, maybe I'll ask you. I mean, is there a role for what? A lot of this is taking place on the sidelines. So where's the WTO in all of this, and what role do you see them playing, Benny? I'm sure you see some, and sort of helping restore some semblance of order.
Well, so one thing that has me a little worried is, there's a ministerial coming up in March of 2026, and that's not far away in terms of trade timelines, and it's not clear what the goal and deliverables for that are going to be. I am hopeful that it is really ideally, and even one of the things that I was always told coming up in the WTO world was that even by the folks that negotiated this, is we may have made a mistake requiring these ministerials every 2 years. Like that was maybe something we should not have pushed for. And we have skipped ministerials in the past because we were not ready. And if there's not a clear reason for having this particular ministerial, I am wondering if it is the best idea to have it if there's not really a clear agenda, because we were so close to, I would say, not doing very well coming out of the last ministerial in Abu Dhabi with holding on to the e-commerce moratorium by the skin of our teeth. And not really having other, substantive outcomes, and not going into this ministerial with substantive outcomes. So there's kind of this, specter of this ministerial out there, unfortunately. But aside from that, you do have a couple general council meetings that are going to be coming up. There will be the regular committee work that's going to be ongoing over the next several months, where there can be some incremental progress on actual issues on TBT, on SPS, on customs valuation, the technical stuff that needs to get done and continues to kind of be the glue between the regulators across all of the countries. And even while all of the geopolitics in trade is going on, you still have kind of the trade nerds getting the work done behind the scenes at the WTO. So that's good. And the General Counsel and some of the CTG, Council on Trade and Goods, might have some things that they can advance on transparency. But I don't have a lot of hopes for big outcomes over the next several months.
The only good news is people's expectations will be so low that maybe
anything that happens. Well, and even just to your point, Dawn, I think it's an obvious one. We'll move on. But, if the WTO is not exactly known for its, expeditious pace, and if you can't get, if 2 years is too short to get ministers together to reach agreements on something, it makes you wonder, what you can, the pace at which things are moving forward. And world trade and technology and all these other things is moving at lightning speed. That's always been an issue, or it's been an issue, for a while, that the WTO has a hard time keeping up with it because of the need, because it's so difficult to reach consensus. And that's not gotten any easier, obviously, now that the U.S. is not playing the role that it has traditionally played.
I mean, it was great that the fish agreement went into force. You know, they can
Yes.
they have enough countries, so that's, you know, they can sing the praises on that. But I think if you're too close to walking the line of disaster or going backwards, it would be better to
I
postpone. I
mean,
don't know if it's an option, but
it's the better of the two.
yeah.
Um, let's go back to Asia a little bit because that is going to come up this week, and then we'll move on to a few other things, I think. We talked a little bit about China, and we'll see what happens this week. I think, Wendy, you summed it up well, the different options potentially there and heading into next year. There's also, I think we talked a little bit last week too about the activity in the rest of the region. I get the sense that the administration, and this is partially aimed at China and partially on its own for its own sake, pushing and because it's an opportunity to meet, but they're trying to get done several other bilateral reciprocal trade agreements with other Asian partners. You've got three we keep hearing about. Ambassador Greer mentioned in ASEAN, those being or in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia. None of them have been completed as of today. And then you've got a very large economy that Trump, which is Korea, which has also been under negotiation for a long time toward completion. There have been, stops along the way where they've made announcements. And this is Trump is going to Korea, even though he's not going to the APEC summit meeting. So there's an opportunity to do that. So why don't we start with that? And Wendy, I'll turn to you. It's been a week since we talked about this, but it's coming. Now it's very close. What do you expect to happen next weekend or this week?
So I think, initially I'd been more optimistic that more deals would be concluded. Now, as we get closer, it looks like, from what we're hearing, Malaysia probably looks like the ripest for agreement, maybe followed by Cambodia. But I question whether Indonesia will be taken over the finish line. With respect to Korea, however, and I was cautiously optimistic, reading the press reports out of Korea, there does seem to be continued sticking points with respect to this investment fund. For our viewers, this is this $350 billion investment fund that Korea agreed to in principle, but as the details are being negotiated, more and more of the U.S. demands seem to be just demands that Korea cannot meet. And so my understanding is they're still negotiating in the parameters of that fund. It may go straight to Korea. Maybe there'll be meetings between officials leading up to a summit meeting between President Lee and President Trump. But issues with respect to the size of this investment fund, how much of it is cash up front versus kind of loan guarantees, in terms of the projects that are announced under this investment fund, what's the time frame? Do they all need to be done within Trump's term, or can they, proceed over a 10-year period? Look, if both sides wanted to reach a deal, there is a deal to be reached here. The question is, I think, more, will the U.S. and Korea be able to, will they have the necessary pressures on them to try and reach a deal? I'm concerned if they do not reach a deal by this meeting, that this is such an important action forcing event, then trying to keep that momentum after APEC is going to be very difficult. And as a result, Korea may find itself in a world where it is facing, for example, a 25% tariff on autos for the immediate future.
It's the pressure that's hanging over them to reach the agreement. And I do get the sense, there's a thread here too that links to Southeast Asia, that the administration is being pretty maximalist in its demands. I mean, in terms of wanting specificity, in terms of wanting broad scope, on things like market access. And they're really not prepared to be particularly flexible with respect to those things. I think what I've seen is this kind of effective use of this ratchet effect, where you get them to agree to one thing, and then a joint statement or some sort of press statement, and then you take that and say, okay, and then they think they're off the hook, okay, the tariffs are going to be, and then you say, wait a minute, it's like Columbo, wait, one more thing, and then you got to do this now, or it's got to be done this way, and then you back kind of where you started in terms of the tariffs are still hanging over your head. And I don't know if there's ever an end to that cycle, because
it's interesting because the president's also going to Japan, and he'll meet the new Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi. And here people keep saying, well, what's going to happen on the trade front? And the immediate response would be, well, there's already a trade agreement, so the focus will be on other issues. But it does seem that Japan continues to feel under pressure and may announce some new big purchases of U.S. goods. There may be discussion on actual projects to be launched under the investment fund. So I couldn't agree with you more, Joe, that you're never completely off the hook. There's always a next step and a new demand or a new expectation.
Which of one of these, this connects to China. One of the biggest domestic issues for the U.S. and China is that they stopped buying U.S. soybeans. And I've heard rumors that the U.S. is trying to sell them to other countries in the region, maybe as a new objective that didn't exist before. And maybe that's something, that's going to come up with some of these other larger. I mean, nobody has the population that China has and traditionally has had the demand for soybeans, but those farmers are really hurting. So the other thing that's emerged, by the way, in Southeast Asia is I believe that several of these countries that are close to getting a deal have been that there have been further details that have been shared with them, but not in a formal way, about the rules of origin, which is a big issue actually. It's kind of a dry issue, as we've discussed before, but basically the administration is trying to prevent these countries from replacing China, or from investment moving from China to these countries. And what I understand is that they're basically saying, and they hinted on this Vietnam earlier this year, if there's too much Chinese content in your products coming to the U.S., then they're going to be hit not with the reciprocal tariff, which is generally in the 20% range, but with a much higher tariff of 40%. And I understand that the rate that's being talked about for Chinese content is something like a maximum of 20 to 25%, which is very hard to meet. And so that's also a sticking point, and also one that does not appear to be subject to negotiation, and just goes to show how interconnected all of these agreements, really are to each other too, particularly in Asia.
And I think it also just shows that even if you reach a deal on reciprocal tariffs between like this transshipment tariff or other, threats not related to trade, but also these Section 232 tariffs, you're just not off the hook.
Well, and the complexity of it all for, both traders, as well as I would say for CBP, to have to manage this situation of, you have the country-specific tariff if there is some agreement in place. You have the IEEPA tariff. You have these potentially rules of origin that the countries are going to have to be dealing with. You have the new port fees that are, a consternation. There's no simplified entry with the elimination of de minimis for, small and medium-sized enterprises who may have been relying on that. So the increasing challenges for importers with all of these new trade rules that are potentially being implemented here, and one other thing, just the complexity for CBP, but all of this work that's going on right now, everything going on in trade, while USTR may still be working right now, let's not forget that the government is shut down, and as we all know, as former USTR employees, how much that agency relies on the interagency, on the expertise of CBP or on the expertise of ITA or DHS or EPA or whoever it may be. And to not really have that right now with those agencies being shut down, but still being expected to deliver, for these ASEAN, APEC, China related meetings without the help of their experts necessarily.
I want to talk about one more thing, but just to finish up on what you were saying, Dawn. the complexity, there's two aspects of the complexity. One is the complexity of CBP actually having to enforce all of these new provisions, rules of origin, all the other things you talked about, which it creates more red tape, more bureaucracy, more confusion. It's going to result in trade litigation because there's going to be all this confusion. But there's also just a lot of, I'm hearing from a lot of private sector, companies and associations too, that people don't know what, it's very confusing for them too. As you try to make it, companies are in the process of making plans for 2026. And nobody, aside from the fact that tariffs could change any second, just even implementing what's been done is creating a barrier in itself. And somebody told me yesterday that they were told by CBP that they're no longer, this is something I think all of us have had some work on over the years, trade facilitation and the trade facilitation and aspects of what CBP does and the agreements that have been reached on that CBP, they were told by CBP, and it's a very big company that does a lot of trade. They were told by CBP, we don't do trade facilitation anymore. It's all enforcement. That's what we do now. So when your Customs Bureau, it's a change, it's a sea change for them too. And not to mention the fact, as you said, that they're at sort of skeletal staff levels right now. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, I wanted to mention another aspect of these deals once they're in place, because the EU has a deal, UK has a deal. The headline issue are the tariffs. But for the EU, tariffs are like 3 paragraphs of a 19-paragraph plus agreement. And there's a whole non-tariff barrier component, which is part of the ongoing discussions you're talking about. It's never done, when it's done. I think for the EU, that plays out in the context of these regulatory barriers. And the EU, maybe unlike some of these other countries, are more down the road towards, if they've got a tariff rate, now they have to deal with the non-tariff barriers. And in the EU Leaders Summit yesterday, they gave a big push on the EU's competitiveness agenda, which they're doing for themselves, which is regulatory simplification, but it targets and references a lot of the same regulations like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Corporate Sustainability Directive, various other regulations that are also part of the US-EU deal. And so you have an interesting dynamic where the EU is pushing, I think, very hard for its own competitiveness reasons to address some of these regulatory complications, but then also not wanting to be seen to be doing it for this administration. So you have the two countercurrents on those so-called regulatory barriers. And one of the EU leaders likened this competitive agenda to the German Kinder egg, a chocolate egg that has a little candy in it. Say, well, you can have something that does two things, that is both a candy and it's a toy. It's both, we're doing it for ourselves and we're doing it for the administration. But that's a bit of a hard sell, and they could stumble over themselves. And notably for that person's metaphor, Kinder eggs are blocked from sale in the United States. So
there you go. There's a metaphor there somewhere. I think we've about timed out. There's a number of other things we can talk about. There's some 301 announcements. I'm sorry we didn't get to that this week. We'll get to that as we learn more about them. In fact, they haven't actually been formally announced. So that's a topic for future discussion. And we'll have probably a piece of paper to have an announcement to look at by that time. So I think we should wrap it up. I think we've timed out. This is Joe Damon. Thanks everybody for joining. And join us next week on WITA's Friday Exchange. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange. WITA is the International Trade Membership Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.